Terry, go ahead.
Very good. John, how are we doing on time?
You're great. We're just right on time.
Okay,
Got
so
20
we've got
minutes.
a whole slew of slides here. We're going to go through these pretty quick and try and focus in on the topic John just mentioned. John, if we can go to the first slide here. Yeah, this chart is showing the historical vanadium price as reported by Metal Bulletin, and the basis here is in warehouse Rotterdam. We can see how prices have wound down from the recent peak in mid 2022. Today, prices in the West are either side of $6 a pound of V2O5. Next slide will show us that in China, Middle Bolton also publishes a price FOB China, and in China we can see that price is just at about $5. You can see the very narrow trading range there, which is indicative of a lack of diversity in thoughts about what direction the market's going, really. Next slide. This is looking at the monthly average prices going back to coming off of the price spike of 2018. And the point here is just to show the relationship between the China FOB China price and in warehouse Rotterdam price at various times in this market. The Chinese price will lead the Western price, and at other times the Western price will lead the Chinese price. So right now we're looking at V2O5 at a relatively low level. The reason for that is really primarily a consumption-based issue. In China, there's a lot of vanadium consumed in steel rebars. We think that overall Chinese vanadium consumption is very close to 50% of the global total, and maybe 80 to 85% of that is going into rebars. So we have a situation where something like 40% of global vanadium consumption occurs in Chinese rebar. And this slide is showing us what's occurred in terms of rebar production for the last 3 years. We've been on a very strong downward trend. Next slide, we'll look at weekly rebar production data. And here you can very clearly see the slide from the peak back in July of 2020. We don't have data yet for the last couple of months, but I'm pretty sure nothing's changed here. So in the market that is responsible for 40% of global production, we've seen demand drop by about 50%. So that translates to a decrease in global demand of somewhere around 20%, simply because of what's going on in rebar. Next slide, please. Looking at China, which is, of course, the critical country here in vanadium supply and demand, what we see is the consumption weakening, the blue line here, as a result of the rebar situation. At the same time, we see that production of vanadium increased significantly in 2023, even as the price was winding down. We see the price at the beginning of 2023 above $9, falling down to the $5 to $6 range through the year of 23 and 24. Meanwhile, production's gone up. So that's just not very helpful for the market. This picture showing the global production on an annual basis. And again, we see that uptick in production in 2023. Next slide, please. Yeah, so summary is we've come off of double-digit prices. We're in a position that's not very exciting given the lack of demand in the rebar market, and production has grown significantly in China. Next slide, please. So China exports are an important point to watch. Chinese export availability and price expectations really sets the price in the West because of the fact that vanadium production outside of China is below consumption. We need Chinese exports to maintain a balanced market. And here we see, the exports are typically ranging somewhere around 8,000 metric tons of V, and imports are traditionally relatively small. We do see that situation has changed a bit in 2020, and that's a combination of impacts, I think, of COVID as well as the Ukraine-Russian war. Next slide, please. If we roll that data up and look at net exports, we see that in 2020, China was a net importer of vanadium very temporarily. And here we see the net exports from China today are at a relatively low level compared to history. Next slide, please. We're just looking at this data monthly here, and again, we see this surge in imports into China starting in November of 2022, and easing off a bit since then, while exports have been somewhat steady. Next slide. Again, Chinese net exports on a monthly basis. We see very few months when China is a net importer of vanadium, other than this period in early 2020. Next slide, please. So this is very interesting. What we're doing here is trying to track vanadium that's originally coming out of the ground in Russia. And that vanadium gets processed either in Russia or Austria or in Czech. And just looking at the flows of those Russian origin vanadiums into China is interesting and helpful. I think what we see here is that with the onset of the war, the amount of vanadium flowing from Russia to China, either directly or indirectly, has grown significantly, and that's simply, I think, an issue of liquidity for the Russian material. Next slide, please. So let's go on to the next one, John. Okay, let's look at consumption. We want to talk about vanadium consumption. The first variable to look at is steel production. Here, our forecast is going to assume 1.8 billion tons of steel produced every year for the next several years. Next slide. The other critical factor to think about is what's going to happen in batteries. This is the forecast for vanadium demand in flow batteries, assuming the Guidehouse Insights forecast comes to be. And what you see here is that in 2030, we need about 135,000 metric tons of V for batteries. And just for scale, in 2023, the global market was somewhere around 120,000 metric tons of V. So we're talking about essentially a doubling of the market over the next 6 years if we're going to achieve this forecast from Guidehouse Research. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just some consumption data, and I guess the takeaway here is that a lot of the vast majority of the change that we see over periods here is either in China or it's energy storage related. And what we've done here is forecast future consumption based on traditional growth factors in traditional markets. And then we've laid the Guidehouse Research forecast for energy storage on top of that. Next slide, please. When we run through that exercise, what we see is that the forecast suggests we're going to see some steady but not exciting growth in consumption from traditional markets. And that's really driven by the ongoing growth in specific vanadium consumption rates in the steel industry. There's just economic value through the entire supply chain to replace low-strength carbon manganese steels with high-strength, low-cost, high-strength, low-alloy vanadium-bearing steels. And those economic drivers are very strong. And as a result, we continue to see the share of steel production that contains vanadium going up year on year. And that's what this forecast shows as growth really from the blue bars in this line. And then on top of that, we lay the energy storage demand, and we can see the scale of impact that energy storage could potentially have. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Production here, we see, production has grown at significant rates. We see really 19% growth over 2022 to 2023, and over this entire period, about 5%. Next slide, please. If we look at growth in supply on an annual basis, we can see areas where we've seen extremely high growth. Remember that to achieve the forecast that the Guidehouse Research demand for battery material suggests, we need to see growth of about 12% a year for the next 6 or 7 years to hit those numbers. So traditionally, we don't see growth of 11 or 12% a year, but it has happened in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide kind of brings everything home, looking at consumption, the purple line, which is again the same numbers that we saw in a previous slide. On the consumption side, or on the production side, we're showing the green segment of this bar, which was existing production capacity as of 2023. And the orange segment of this line is expansion that could occur at existing producers. So this segment assumes all of the announcements that have been made publicly by producers of vanadium out there follow through on those promises, and they have a fairly significant increase in vanadium production as a result of that. And then the gray segment in this chart, 74,000 metric tons of V per year by 2030, is what we're going to need from new sources of supply if we're going to achieve the forecast that we're looking at here. So that's a pretty big ask. It's not that it can't be done, but we're going to have to start seeing some capital flowing into new projects here fairly quickly if we're going to achieve that objective. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so again, we're going to have to see if all this comes true, 54,000 metric tons of V from existing suppliers, increased supply, and then we're going to have to see significant new production from new producers, and we'll have to see who comes to market first here. That'll be an important driver. Next slide, please. Okay, just looking at market data here. This slide is based on Vanatech data. What we're looking at is annual consumption in various markets. We stripped the steel demand out of this picture because the scale is just a different scale, and it would make these lines look completely uninteresting. So what we're tracking here is vanadium consumption in some specific target markets. And the takeaway here is titanium market has recovered from COVID. Titanium went flat on its back in COVID, and now we see vanadium demand is back and has surpassed the pre-COVID levels. We see chemicals, rather steady growth, not exciting growth, somewhere along the line of global GDP growth. And then we can see energy storage and what looks to be a bit of an inflection point here as consumption in energy storage moves up significantly year on year from a percentage standpoint and now from a volume standpoint. This chart is comparing the vanadium demand, actual demand by quarter as reported by Vanatech in battery systems versus the Guidehouse forecast. The Guidehouse forecast is an annual forecast. So we simply take that and break that down into quarters to present the Guidehouse forecast over this period. The Vanatech data, again, is data reported by Vanatech members and is probably the best data out there for how much vanadium is actually being deployed out there, either consumed in traditional markets or deployed in batteries. And so this picture shows you that the actual consumption has lagged the Guidehouse consumption a bit. First quarter of 2024, the Vanatech data just came out last night, so I didn't have a chance to include that here. But I think that data will show us that in the first quarter of 2024, actual consumption as measured by Vanatech is falling a bit behind the Guidehouse forecast requirements. Next slide, please. We'll look at the same data, but not on a stack basis, but looking at individual regions, and you can see that by and large, Asia Pacific is the most important market here, with North America being the second most important market. Next slide, please. And here we're just kind of drilling down on the Asia Pacific market. And interestingly enough here, what we see is that the actual consumption has been at or above the Guidehouse research numbers really for the last 2 years. And that's quite encouraging. So consumption, actual deployment in the batteries has been a little bit weak compared to the Guidehouse forecast. Most of the actions in China, I think the shortcoming in actual consumption versus Guidehouse has been, a function of both Southeast Asia and North America. And in North America, we are seeing some significant uptick right now in both discussions and actual requirements for electrolyte going into batteries. So I think we're seeing that picture start to change. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is again just historical pricing data. This is nominal pricing, not inflated. And we see a mean price of 835 going back to January 2004, and a median of 732. Next slide, please. We look at the price distribution chart, we see that prices below the current level of $6 in the West are extremely rare. Next slide. But we're looking at data over a 20-year period on a nominal basis. We really need to look at this on an inflated basis. If we were roll this PPI index into that data, John, next slide, what we see is that same shape of the price history. Obviously, numbers are different. And in this case, the mean price is 1226 and the median is 1028. Next slide will show the price distribution for the real data or the inflated data. And here we see, prices below $7 are extremely rare. Next slide, please. And this is just showing the annualized price. So what we've got here is a situation where vanadium market is at a relatively low level compared to history. And as we look at the situation, supply and demand are a bit out of balance right now, with demand in rebar being very weak, and hopefully that's going to be uplifted a bit by growing demand in batteries as we go forward. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, that's all we really have here. If you just want to go through this real quick, John, US Vanadium is making a lot of electrolyte in Arkansas. We're seeing a lot of activity right now and a lot of opportunities, not only in North America, but other places as well. Next slide, John. Maybe that's it. Okay, we make high purity electrolyte. Let's end it right there. And if we have any time left, we'll get it back here, but appreciate the opportunity to talk here. John, if you go to this last slide, if anybody has any questions or comments, you can reach me here at TTP Squared or US Vanadium. Please send me a message and I'll be happy to communicate with you. Thank you.
Terry, there is one question in the Q&A for you about where is the Chinese vanadium being exported to?
Well, a lot of exports from China, typically the exports are commodity grade material that's going eventually into the steel industry. It's typically V2O5, and it's a lot of it goes to Korea for conversion to ferrovanadium. Some of it goes to Japan. A lot of it goes to China for conversion to ferrovanadium, and that ferrovanadium, which is China, is Canadian origin, will eventually show up in North America. And a lot of Chinese material gets exported to Rotterdam, where it goes either to ferrovanadium converters or to the trade.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. Great presentation. Hoping to see continued growth in the battery to offset, as you said, some of the weakness in rebar in China.